I don't know. But I'm still comfortable with the title
Okay.
because it gets attention and it provokes conversation.
So I just finished watching Paul Vanderklay's latest upload about the CRCNA and same-sex marriage. Thought it was a great talk, and I think it paired very well with Jordan Peterson's recent Louder with Crowder appearance. And for those just listening, I'll just read through some notes I took or wrote down to give you an idea of where I'm going with this and how I'm thinking they interlink. And then I'll play about a 10 or 12 minute clip from Louder with Crowder. And I don't think I'll play anything from Paul Vanderklay's channel because I think most people familiar with my channel are listening and watching his videos regularly and are familiar with the content there. So some of the notes I took and the perspective I want to try to take here is the left hemisphere, right hemisphere ways of tending to the world via McGilchrist, unsurprisingly. In Jordan's interview, you'll see he talks about the political leaking into the religious domain and the scientific leaking into the political domain. And I think there's two paths forwards. Maybe I'll get into that in more detail at the end. But for now, I'll just say some of my notes here. It's all domains get merged into one domain, and I think that is top-down left hemispheric tyranny, or it's all domains get integrated into one pattern. And that's more of a sustainable balance. It's the rule of the now, the capital N now, which I take to be the eternal pattern of patterns, which balances the past and future, right hemisphere, left hemisphere, ways of attending, good and evil, etc., etc. So let's start with Jordan Peterson here.
Gaining the weight so quickly. I mean, I think this is something people don't realize psychologically, and I would imagine it happens to a varying degree, but long term, right now we've sort of talked, I've talked about this on the show to kind of go back to something a little more philosophical. The fat pride movement, for example, and this sort of ties in obviously with, as we're struggling with an international pandemic and the signal being as preventative, comorbidity is obesity, but we're not allowed to talk about it because we've declared that it's beautiful. When I gained that much weight very quickly, I felt it on my joints. Now, keep in mind, this was obviously fluid in my thoracic cavity was basically, medically induced. It was a complication. But I felt like a very different person, and it was amazing how much it also affected my psyche. And I've got to imagine that even if that's happening over the course of a long period of time, sure, physiologically you adjust more, the connective tissue, but it's got to have an effect on your mental state. And like you've talked about, even losing the weight, I mean, right now, this is right. Have we bound ourselves in such a knot to kind of go here with, to me, COVID and the fat pride, and we need to delineate people who are overweight and want to lose weight, and that's an entirely different situation than someone saying, you will declare me beautiful and healthy at the same time that we're told to follow science.
We can talk about this. Well, one of the things I've really been thinking about lately, and I'm going to write the next book that I'm going to write about this, I think, at least in part, is that it seems to me that if we don't have a delineated space conceptually and socially for the sacred and the religious, and that it's put in its proper relationship to the other things that we're concerned about, then what happens is not that we become pure rationalists, as people like Dawkins and Harris, for example, might hope, but that much that should never be religious instantly becomes contaminated with it.
Right.
And so an issue like body size, relative obesity, starts to take on this intensely moral element. And the people who are pushing hard against shaming someone if they're fat, they have their point, but it shouldn't be a moral issue to begin with. If you're overweight, it's not because you're a bad person. There's all sorts of reasons that you might be overweight, and we should be able to have a discussion about that without it becoming moral, and we can't. And part of the reason for that is, well, we don't know what's sacred and what isn't, and we don't even know that some things have to be, and we certainly don't know what things should be. And so everything in our political landscape is becoming contaminated, as far as I can tell, with what are essentially religious concerns. And part of the reason for that is, well, we don't know what's sacred and what isn't, and we don't even know that some things have to be, and we certainly don't know what things should be. And so everything in our political landscape is becoming contaminated, as far as I can tell, with what are essentially religious concerns. And I mean that psychologically, not theologically.
And can the same thing be happening here in the religious domain? That, again, the political is leaking into the religious. And earlier in the conversation, I believe Nick here said that sexuality is basically decided by the times you live in. So, you know, he definitely has, I think, a descriptive point. And I'm saying this as someone who's very sympathetic to his view, but I'm also sympathetic to what Vanderklay is saying in terms of being open-minded about the issue, while also having a germ of an opinion formulated. So, you know, maybe my thoughts are not as well thought out as Vanderklay, but I'm seeing a parallel here between what Jordan's talking about and, you know, what's going on here with Nick and Vanderklay. I think Nick is describing what sexuality has been, what we can see of sexuality, and Vanderklay is trying to say, well, what is the Bible prescribing about sexuality? And Nick is saying, well, the Bible's being more descriptive when it comes to sexuality, and it's really determined by the times. I think he's looking back and he's telling us an accurate description, but what was happening in the times was the value judgment that Vanderklay is talking about. And either the Christians looked around them and said, okay, it's the sexuality of the times, so I guess older men can have young boys as companions, and worse, you know what I'm saying, and so on and so forth. So did they look at the times and say that the sexuality of the times was just fine, or did they make a judgment about what that is? And again, I'm saying this with a lot of sympathy towards Nick's position. I won't get into all the personal connections I have with what's going on with this debate, because I don't think it's, when you start bringing up anecdotes, I don't think it's that useful. Though I did, you know, love hearing his personal story. It was really, really, really touching. I'll get back to Jordan now.
Yeah.
So, and that's not good. It's very bad. It also means that we're going to be more tempted to elevate our leaders, our political leaders, into spaces of treatment that should be reserved for the sacred, and that's not a good thing either. I mean, politicians are basically administrators in that's the proper sense. That's the proper conception.
Right.
So,
yeah, as opposed to leaders who are really almost executive decision makers. That's not necessarily what they're supposed to be empowered to do.
yeah, well, they're not kings.
No.
They're not kings. I mean, one of the weaknesses, I think, of the American political system, which I admire greatly, is that it's not a monarchy. It's not a constitutional monarchy. And I think the advantage to a constitutional monarchy is that you have someone carry the weight of the symbolism of the state. And so, because you see this, and you really see this in the U.S., and you see it manifest itself in celebrity culture too. It's very hard for Americans not to turn the president and his family into something like the royal family. And Americans place a tremendous amount of attention on the first family. It's very foreign to Canadians because we never do that in Canada for one reason or another. But you know, your president has to carry all that symbolic weight, and that's not good. I think it's a problem.
It's a stark contrast. You know, we have assassination attempts in Canada. They have successful pyings of the prime minister. Well, they will get pied in the face, and that has happened many times. Now, I tell Americans that. They go, "What you mean like your I go, "Yes, like our president." They go, "Like what? Like a Boston cream pie, right in the face, on a podium, on national television." It has happened multiple times. They go, "You can't be serious." I say, yes, I am. I had someone on this show. It's interesting that you bring up sort of discussing the monarchy. I don't remember who it was, and so please, if this person remembers, I don't want to misgiving them credit. Or maybe they were quoting a philosopher. Said, you know, the one thing that people sort of fail to realize about the monarchy is, unlike pure democracy, at least in the sense with the monarchy or royal family, they had some kind of attachment to their legacy and wanting to be remembered fondly, wanting to be remembered well, because really there wouldn't be this capability of passing the buck that you voted for this, that this is a democracy. So in some ways they were actually more beholden to some kind of at least self-governing moral compass, moral guidance, code of ethics. He said, and that's one of the sort of the great attributes that people often miss out on, I thought, very introspectively, on the monarchy. The worst part, the fruity hats.
You're not a fan of the hats?
Not a fan of the hats. But I'm just, the first part was true. The second part, that was just my editorializing. But it is interesting, though, too. I mean, it is true. It's give unto us a king. This is as old as time. I mean, this is really one of the original sins of the Bible. And one thing, going back to what you're talking about, sort of not keeping our sacred institutions separate, I see a lot when I grew up.
No, and not even noticing that we actually need a space for the sacred, and we need to figure out what that is. And it isn't optional, and this is one of the problems I have with the atheist rationalist types, is that, and that the mistake they're making, I believe, is that they treat religion as if it's a set of propositions about the nature of reality, like a scientific theory. And religious people make a huge mistake because they react to the scientific criticisms also as if that's the case. But the religious this has nothing to do with an argument for or against the existence of God, by the way. That's a separate issue.
Right.
It's that the religious covers all sorts of elements of experience that aren't propositionalized. They're not statements about the structure of reality. So architecture has a religious element. You certainly see that in the cathedrals. Music, ritual.
Yeah.
All of that.
And going back to Vanderklay and Nick here talking, your sexual life has a religious meaning. In fact, it's so profound and deep that you don't realize it. You're like a fish in water. You don't realize you're surrounded by water because you're surrounded by this religion. And I'm drawing on a class I took in college about world religions and a book. What was it called now? The Origins and History of Consciousness by Erich von Neumann, a student of Jung. So I'm referring to that when I'm talking about the human sexuality as having, as divulging and participating in certain patterns, again, in the Pageauian sense of patterns. And so I think Nick's position would be, I don't know, would he say that? Is that position considered that you're participating in a pattern of patterns with your sexuality as much as any other part of your life? And I think maybe some people hyper-focus on the sexual aspect. I think this is maybe is Nick's point. We hyper-focus on the sexual aspect of life and want to put a rule book and measuring stick towards that. Whereas Nick says, how come we're not hyper-focused on another aspect of life like greed? And I think, that's something I've always questioned as well. I always wondered, I don't like these rule books. I don't like the code of conducts. I don't like the measuring stick because I think it's totally against what I read in the Bible. And again, Nick says, well, we all have different interpretations, and to some extent, that's true, but I think Vanderklay says the words do mean what the words mean, basically, and there is a context, there is a socio and cultural context that we're looking at. Like I mentioned previously, did the early Christians adopt the sexual lives and practices of those around them in the times and places that they were living, or did the church really stand out against their contexts? And you could look at the Jews as always trying to partition themselves from the others and making differences known. I mean, that seems pretty obvious. Anyway, I'll go back to Peterson.
It's more in the domain of the arts, let's say. So that's technically speaking. So, but then also within the domain of human experience. So we all have the capacity to experience awe, for example, and we can experience that to a greater or lesser degree. And I would say the more profound the experience of awe, the more it shades into what's always been described in religious terms. And so you can say, well, we'll dispense with religion, but, well, what about the experience of awe? That's not a proposition. It's not an argument. It's something that happens to you. And it takes you unaware, right? You don't necessarily expect it to happen, although sometimes you'll seek it out. And you experience awe when you're in the face, and it seems to me that this is the case. You experience awe when you're faced by something that calls you, it's beyond you, it's greater than you, so you see that and you experience that, but then it also calls to you in some sense to be better than you are.
Right.
And that seems to be an intrinsic part of the experience. And so, and there's no just rationally dispensing with that, and atheist or not, you can experience this. I think you experience it when you look up at the night sky if you're somewhere extraordinarily dark. And maybe that it's a problem that modern people often don't have that experience now. And so the argument I'm formulating, I suppose, and like I said, this is part of the next book I'm planning to write, is that we need to have a really serious conversation about the psychological reality of the religious and how it exists in relationship to, let's say, the political or the ideological. Because if that's all mangled together incautiously, all sorts of things happen that we don't want to have happened. And that's the issue of rendering unto God what is God and unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And that's also the idea that church and state need to be separated, not only politically and constitutionally, say, but also conceptually.
Yeah.
Otherwise we get muddied up. And so what the atheist types, what they haven't grappled with, as far as I can tell, is, well, there is a hierarchy of values. Some values are lesser than others. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to pursue what you believe to be the most important. So some things announce themselves as more important than other things. There's a ranking of those. The most important issues, they're in the domain of something approximating the religious. And whenever you touch on them, you elicit from people religious experience, religious reactions. And like I said, that has nothing to do with an argument for or against the existence of God. It's a philosophical and conceptual issue. And part of the problem that we're facing in our society is that we're muddying the lines. And that means all sorts of things get inflated beyond their necessary importance. And it also means that the arguments aren't about what we're arguing about at all. They're about something underneath that's hidden.
Yeah.
And that pops up everywhere.
So is that what is happening with the whole gay marriage debate in Vanderklay's video here? And in general, not just between these two. But I think, there's definitely something's going on. I'm leaving that as a question because I know this is a very difficult topic, and both of these guys don't want their church to be split over it. But in the end, how are we going to, what ideal are we going to hold up, as Crowder put forth in the very beginning, how you couldn't fat shame, and again, like Jordan says, there's reasons why you shouldn't fat shame, like there's other ways to go about handling the issue. But Crowder said what happened was sort of the reverse of the ideal became the ideal. So to Vanderklay's point, when we introduce a less than ideal marriage, and divorce would be one of those less than ideal, when divorce happens, that's not ideal, right? And so we're talking about the ordinary conceptual male-female marriages have their unideal patterns as well. And it's not just divorce, it's everything that leads to a divorce. That's the pattern starts to disintegrate, and that leads to the divorce. But anyway, introducing the male-male marriage would be a less than ideal pattern. And are we in danger of subverting our ideals? And are we doing it, Nick might say, well, that's a slippery slope argument, and saying we're going one step towards degenerating the pattern is, you could say, is like the people in the 50s saying, well, you're supporting pedophiles or something. And I totally see that perspective. But I think Vanderklay is right to raise the questions, because we need to question. We don't know, like Jordan says, we don't know where to draw these lines, and that's why I think it's so important to have the right hemisphere, left hemisphere, right hemisphere balance, the sustainable rule of now, and that keeps the traditions whole while informing us how to proceed with the current variables, the current problems that we face. So the whole message here, I think what these guys are doing here is just that. They're coming together through love, because they both care about people and the church and the issues that affect the people and the church, and they're both trying to give forth their position on how the pattern can be sustained and what the best pattern really is, and what the pattern, well, maybe Nick would say, well, we're always interpreting the pattern differently through time. He gives many examples, which, again, it's hard to refute that. But I think, it's important on how we have come to those decisions. And are we letting the political bleed into the religious domain? It's worth asking that question. It's definitely worth asking that question, because when all the boundaries are dissolved, and when we start dissolving them one boundary at a time, what will be left? I think Terence McKenna says that when things no longer make sense, people look to a time prior when things did make sense. And so what time period might we be going to? Might we be going to the 50s again? Would that be better if society has so many problems with its boundaries that we end up back in the 50s? I think that's sort of like how unintended consequences happen, right? And it seems to happen all the time, as Jordan will say. I'll get back to Jordan because he's obviously much better to listen to. But he's going to say that as a scientist, you learn that you can't really predict the outcomes of even very controlled experiments. And oftentimes the experiments will show results that are contrary to your theories and your predictions. And those are the most interesting ones, really. And that shows you that when you have, say, the science of COVID-19, you can't get from the science to a prescription of political policy, because it's almost impossible to predict what the policy will enact in reality.
I think no more apparent than actually, to sort of piggyback on that, but explain a little bit of a difference in where I was raised. I was on YouTube in 2006, right? And then 2009 doing every week, and there were no conservatives, there were no real Christians, that no one of significant note, not like today, like yourself or even other Christian and political channels out there, self-help, however we want to describe them. It was the edgy atheist territory, right? It was, you were an atheist or bust. And I watched them sort of always try and attack Christians, and I wouldn't say in a way that's completely unfounded with, well, how do you reconcile your religion in the face of this scientific data? That's what they would often be arguing, or the evolution argument was very big back then. Whereas now, I see it on the flip side, where especially in this sort of era of COVID, where, like you're talking about, in muddying the lines, sometimes science has tried to insert itself and almost replace religion. And people, not necessarily science itself, but people have tried to turn to science as a religion for example, things that are unexplainable sometimes.
Well, the other problem that comes up there, as far as I can tell, and Sam Harris has tried to address this, although I don't think he's done it successfully, is that we're always faced with the problem of perception and action. We have to see the world, we have to hear the world, we have to interact with the world through our senses, and we have to act. None of that's optional. And even to perceive something, you have to select what's important and what isn't. So if you listen to someone in a crowded room, you focus in on their speech and not on the speech of the people in the background.
Right.
And so you prioritize that person's speech in the hierarchy of value that guides your perception. Well, so you're stuck with existing inside a system of value. There's no way out of that. Well, it isn't obvious at all that science can provide us with guides as to what constitutes the appropriate values. And it's not obvious to scientists. In fact, I would say that science in some sense was designed so that that was something it didn't even try to do. Right. Because it's trying to present an objective viewpoint, devoid of, to the degree that it's possible, devoid of a priori value judgments. But then you have this whole domain of, well, we need to make judgments of value. Well, okay, where do they come from? And when I point out, for example, that there are things that call to you experientially that are outside of rationality, I would say to the atheists, well, why don't you look at the science of religious experience, let's say, or that domain, and try to account for that from within your particular perspective. If you criticize the religious people for not following the science, it's a lot of, what are you going to do with this fact that human beings are wired, for example, to admire and to imitate that which they find calls them to a greater self.
Right.
That's the instinct for imitation. And well, so what is it we're imitating? And why do we imitate that particular value? And so
And you might say, Nick is imitating Christ in his position from his perspective, and Vanderklay is imitating Christ from his perspective with his position. And so even when we're looking at values from within a value system, leaving out the science altogether, we come to a head. Like, what is going to happen with this issue?
Well, that's a domain of unexplored mystery that has to be taken seriously. This isn't a matter of mere rationality, by no means.
And I think you make a great point about the hierarchy of values, and so you end up looking toward a messianic figure. I mean, this is kind of what was supposed to be beautiful to me about the scientific process. I hate the word the science now. The science is the equivalent to, it is an equivalent to religion, just like Scientology at a certain point. They put science in the name, the science, especially if someone says that with a Fauci pillow in their office, which Governor Whitmer did of my wonderful home state of Michigan. Science, what was beautiful about it is that it wasn't determined by consensus. Like you said, that was by design. It was determined by truth. It didn't necessitate, and as a matter of fact, it rejected people saying, this is the right science because of consensus. No. If the consensus is the world is flat, but it's wrong, the science says that you're wrong. And now we're at this point where people don't even understand they're making these same religious judgments and saying, when we say trust the science, we're saying Fauci. Well, hold on a second. What about when Fauci goes against the World Health Organization? What about when the World Health Organization doesn't actually correspond with the CDC? What about the fact that you have other scientists at the time, for example, who've come out and said Fauci was wrong while he was talking about the fact that if you lived in a home with a parent who had AIDS, you could catch it from a cereal box. This is all on the record. You had all kinds of other scientists who are more qualified who said, this is not the guy, and people, in not understanding that they've made this value judgment, have said, no, I've decided he's the guy. And this is a real problem right now because, this kind of brings me, and I hope that this all makes sense, and you can just tell me if I'm stammering. I've always said my litmus test for a conspiracy theory, when you have to kind of dismiss it, right? You can't go through every conspiracy that someone brings up. You'd have to debunk. You'd have too much to debunk. You do have to start with how many people is they? How many people is they in this conspiracy theory? How many people have to be involved?
So one of the things you're suggesting implicitly is that one of the ways we establish value judgments is through consensus. But that isn't how we do science. And fair enough. But it does point to some mechanism for the establishment of value. So if you're trying to figure out what's important, what isn't, well, one way you can do that is to see what people in general think. And that might be a reasonable thing to do. But as you pointed out, that's not part of the scientific process. Certainly not. It'd be very weak if it was.
Right. And now I guess my point that I was going to sort of, in where we live, the domain, big tech, this sort of sphere where we, one point, we're really grateful that there weren't gatekeepers. The conspiracy now, when we say, hold on a second, we're talking about Fauci, the CDC, and scientific guidelines that fly in the face of other scientific guidelines, the they in this conspiracy is really only about 5 heads of organizations. People have decided about 5, you're talking about 5 companies and about 2 or 3 international governing bodies who determine what is allowed to be spoken, regardless of your scientific qualifications, for it to be considered proper or misinformation. And by the way, they can change that a week from now, and we've documented at least 20-something times. That, to me, is religious dogma.
I talked to John Anderson last week. He's was the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia a number of years ago.
Right.
He was Finance Minister when they ran something like 5 consecutive budget surpluses nationally. That's a hell of an accomplishment for a Western democracy, man. So he's a very sensible guy. And we were talking about what was happening in Australia underneath this as a consequence of the COVID pandemic and various other causes. And his point essentially too was that, well, because politicians in some sense are abdicating their responsibility, we're forcing medical people to make what are essentially political decisions. And so just as much of the problems that beset us politically are a consequence of the bleeding over of religious concerns into the political domain, we now have bleeding over of the scientific concerns into the political domain because politicians are using these experts as proxies for their own particular, for pushing forward their own particular ideological positions. And that's a very dangerous misuse of science. And so you see that in the climate change discussion too, where the insistence is, well, here's the problem, and this is the magnitude of the problem, and it's a moral issue, and you have to accept that, or you're not a good person, or you're ignorant, or you're malevolent, you're a bad person fundamentally. But the part of the reason that insistence is there is because there's a pack of solutions at hand in that person's imagination that are usually ideological in nature.
Yeah.
And if the first proposition is true, then that the imposition of that particular set of solutions is a fait accompli. And so not examining that is extraordinarily dangerous, because if you have that ideological set of solutions, then you're going to be extraordinarily tempted to co-opt the force of the scientific endeavor as a justification for your political ambitions. It's very difficult for people to separate those sorts of things out. Like, I believe personally, I believe this, is that it's very, very probable to me that massive solutions to the climate change problem, like global scale solutions, even national scale solutions, are going to cause far more trouble than the problem itself will cause. I really believe that.
Of course.
So,
yeah, no, I don't think there's any question about that. I mean, I learned that again when I was 20 years old, and I went to the Cancun Climate Summit, and I watched Ted Turner propose China's one-child policy to thunderous applause. Everyone had flown into Cancun.
Yeah,
They hadn't heard of Skype. I was there. And I said, oh, and you know what? For me, that's when I stopped trying to feign being a centrist. I said, oh, no.
Why did that strike you so hard, do you think? How old were you? And so why did that hit you so hard?
Would have been 21 or 22. I just started at Fox News. I think it struck me so hard because it was sort of funny. You know, you always see the hypocrisy. Everyone's a hypocrite. I always say, don't focus on the hypocrisy. Focus on the whether it's genuine. For example, Nancy Pelosi was a hypocrite when she went and had her air vortex blown out. It's not that she's a hypocrite. It's that she doesn't believe about COVID, what she tells her constituents, or she wouldn't be going out in public and putting her head into a particle accelerator. So the issue there is, I had seen the hypocrisy. It was kind of funny. They all really were all a bunch of climate scientists finding an excuse to vacation in Cancun. This is when it was still the Kyoto Protocol. And then it hit me when about as bad of a policy as you can think of, right? Almost a policy that would be considered a straw man if you were to say to an environmental, almost paganist, which is what I would determine some of these people to be now who worship at the altar of Gaia. If you were to say, well, how far does it go? Like China's one-child policy? They would have said, oh, okay, straw man, red herring, and rightfully so.
I would think many of them would have agreed with it in their heart of hearts. It's like, yeah, you know goddamn well there's too many people on this planet. It's like they have to go somewhere or other. We're a cancer on the surface of the planet.
Well, I guess I gave them the benefit of the doubt. And then hearing Ted Turner say it, and I thought, that's as extreme as it gets, and that's not a problem. Okay, I'm out. I'm not on board with any. I'm not going to feign being a centrist here because this guy wants to.
Okay, so why did you think that was a bad idea? So, like, why not? Why not have fewer people? And why wouldn't that be better for the planet? What do you see as a danger in that?
Well, that comes from a fundamental worldview where I don't believe that that basically our role here is to be subservient to the planet. Our role here is to go forth and subdue the planet. And that we were created in the image of God, and not the wildebeest, not the beasts of the field, nor the fish of the sea. I think we need to be good stewards of the planet. But the minute you start getting into the territory of eliminating human life for the betterment of the planet, to me, that's a pagan religion diametrically opposed to not only, obviously, the Christian worldview, but a pro-human worldview. I just don't think you can do it. You're killing babies, right? So, you can't tell, who's going to, we talk about taxes. Who's going to enforce, hey, hold on a second, is that child number 2? I mean, we know what happens in China. I made jokes about them.
Yeah, well, that's a straightforward route to walk down. It's like, yeah, you really want to cede that much power to your governmental structure?
Right.
And you're not worried about authoritarianism? Are you sure of that? And are you so sure that your motives for positing that have nothing to do with anything but your saint-like devotion to the long-term well-being of the entire planet? You're really sure of that? Are you? And why? And how come you're not sure that maybe you're not a bit bitter and maybe you just don't like people that much because life is hard and you've suffered a lot and you're angry and this is a bit of revenge? And like, if you don't think you have motivations like that, then I don't think you've thought very much, because if you put someone in a vice president and make them suffer, they're going to produce all sorts of bitter ideas. Yeah. And so we have to watch out for that. We have to be very careful about that. So
Well, I think that's an interesting parallel, right? The climate situation, because I've always said this. I'm not saying that there is no impact, of course, in humans and climate change. And I'm not a scientist. I don't work for NOAA, even though they get their predictions wrong every single year. But my point is, I don't hold myself out to be an expert. However, I can say it doesn't pass a sniff test when I read the entire 16-page Green New Deal and it says, and social justice and social justice and equity in there. I'm like, well, hold on a second. You just added everything into this bill. This doesn't make sense, right? I don't have to say, hey, here are my present my scientific qualifications to say, I don't believe that AOC or the UN have a shot in fixing it and getting China to play in line. When you look at the policy proposals.
I have to cut this short. There's a lot to comment on right there. But some things have come up in real life, as they say, and I have to end the video.